tenemos un invitado muy especial, el doctor Gary Hofbauer. Lo invitamos al Colegio de México a darnos una conferencia sobre el tema de las perspectivas de política comercial del nuevo presidente electo Donald Trump y sus implicaciones para México. Yo quisiera iniciar dando alguna introducción. El tema de comercio internacional siempre ha sido muy importante para Estados Unidos. Es uno de los mecanismos a través del cual Estados Unidos ha generado una gran cantidad de crecimiento, pero aún más importante ha sido que Estados Unidos por muchos años, desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial, fue uno de los grandes promotores de un sistema económico liberal abierto basado en reglas, con instituciones como el GATT, como el FMI, y un poco bajo la idea de que este orden económico liberal es muy importante, no solo para su propio beneficio, sino para el beneficio de todos los países del mundo. Era un resultado de su convicción de que la Segunda Guerra Mundial se había iniciado por las guerras, por los mercados y comerciales que se habían generado durante la época de los 30. Entonces Estados Unidos desde esa época se convirtió en el campeón defensor de este sistema liberal. A partir de esa época ha habido periodos hasta el presente en que en ocasiones esa convicción de la defensa de los libres mercados tenía que tener algunas revisiones o entraba en crisis en términos de política interna, pero normalmente cada nuevo gobierno o después de un breve periodo todos recuperaban esta idea de que los mercados abiertos a nivel internacional eran de gran importancia para la economía norteamericana. En este momento estamos en un cambio de paradigma. Todo parece indicar que el nuevo presidente electo está cuestionando este dogma, si se puede decir, esta defensa. Y entonces el profesor Hofbauer lo invitamos para que nos diera una visión sobre qué está pasando en Estados Unidos y qué significa la estrategia y las propuestas de política que está planteando el presidente Trump. Voy a iniciar entonces ahora la presentación. Professor Hofbauer, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation to come to Mexico and give us some sense of what is going on in the United States. I started in my Spanish introduction suggesting, probably you understood me, suggesting that the United States has always been the champion, the defender of the liberal economic order, and not only internally, domestically, but also on the international level, out of a perception, a conviction that the open markets were a way through which all countries could benefit and could prosper, etc. And that's why U.S. always promoted the idea GATT first, and then agreements, regional agreements, if it was necessary, etc. And what I was saying at the end of my introduction was that all this apparently has changed, or it has the potential to change. And so I would like to ask you, the first question would be, what's happened? Why is it that we have a candidate that goes against all this orthodoxy or these convictions that the United States defended for so long since the World War period? Can you give us a sense, please?
Yes, I mean, this is a great kind of revolution in terms of the approach. I think the two big reasons are economic. Firstly, for average households over the last 15 or 20 years, they have not had much increase in their income, average households. What has happened instead is that the income distribution has shifted towards the top part of the population. So the top 1% had about 8% of total national income in, say, 1995, and now it's about 20%. So a big shift up. This is due to technology being so much more important in all kinds of jobs. Every kind of job uses more information technology and so forth. But the political blame has gone on globalization. Globalization is part of the story, but it's the smaller part of the story. The bigger part is the technological revolution. So that's I think that's an underlying, very strong force. The other force of some consequence is that the recovery from the 2008-2009 financial crisis, what we call the Great Recession, has been rather slow. So many people are out of work for a long period of time. Now we're back to close to full employment now, but people are remembering the bad times, and they're blaming, wrongly, the bad times on globalization, in part. So I think it's a misperception by large numbers of Americans as to the source of their woes, but it's also the fact that the United States doesn't do much for people who are hurt by technology. They lose their jobs because the technology needs fewer people, and we've seen it year by year in manufacturing. You need fewer people, but you produce as much or even more than you did before, and also in many services, banking and hotels and so on. And so people are unemployed. But we don't do very much for them. And so it's a hard life to get back into some kind of productive employment. And many people know about these stories, even though they didn't experience them themselves. And again, tendency to blame that on globalization, very strong political tendency. So to me, those are the underlying features of what we've seen.
But somehow you suggested in your lecture that there is the public perception, or the general public does not necessarily support this idea. There seems to be a majority of Americans who view trade agreements in a positive way. No?
That's correct. A majority of Americans do view trade agreements, and they view trade more generally in a positive way. So they're sticking with the old-time religion, if you will. They still believe it. But the ones who don't believe it, they are kind of much stronger in their opinions than the ones who do believe it, and they have captured the left wing of the Democratic Party, and they're very influential in the whole Trump movement. And so that's determined. I mean, usually, as you know, being an outstanding political scientist, it's small groups of very dedicated people who change the political landscape as opposed to the broad public opinion.
I think in the political science they say concentrated costs with the generalized and disaggregated benefits.
Yes, right.
So you need to somehow, politically you will need to find ways in which the general interest has some kind of way to be defended, but somehow it hasn't happened.
It didn't happen.
Well, it used to be, it used to be the president who would somehow support the idea, the general wealth, is free trade, but no, it doesn't happen anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, Clinton was very good at this. He would, Democrat, so forth, but he would point to the reality of globalization and the reality of needing to adapt to it, and it will benefit the general public. And it does. I mean, our very detailed calculations and estimates show that the benefits to the American public of globalization since the Second World War amount to about $10,000 per American household. I mean, these are big benefits, but as you say, they're dispersed and not appreciated.
Now, but there is also another thing that you pointed out in your lecture, the fact that the Republican Party used to be a big support, the party that supported open markets and trade agreements, but somehow that's gone.
Well, right, Trump has flipped the party. I mean, even before the election, if we go back to 2015 during the primary period, I would say generally the Republican Party in the Congress was quite in favor of continuing the agenda of open markets, was in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It looked like it would go through. In the primary debate, Governor Kasich was for open trade. Rubio seemed to be somewhat there. Bush was somewhat there, and then Trump was very strongly against. And Senator Cruz was for it before he was against it. He's flipped in the course of the primary debates. But Trump prevailed. He was the stronger candidate, and he's very adamant on this issue, very much against China, very much critical of Mexico, critical of NAFTA. And now that he's won, big surprise to everybody. You know, when you're a winner, your party follows you.
Now, let me something that occurred to me.
Yes.
There is in Mexico this perception that the Hillary Clinton was the wrong candidate. That if Senator Sanders would have been the nominee from the Democratic Party, he would have won. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's baloney. And here's why. In the primary campaign, Clinton did not want to be very critical of Sanders because she wanted his support for the general election. And so they didn't do any deep investigating reporting and exposure on the stands he's taken over the years, which are very different than the popular mood in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a true socialist. We're not a socialist country. And, you know, all kinds of views which were antithetical. He didn't get along with his fellow senators on many issues. All this stuff could have been exposed, but it wasn't exposed. And by the time it came to the general election, Trump had no interest in attacking Sanders. He wanted to attack Clinton. Yeah. So Sanders really didn't have to go through what I call the bath of fire of being a presidential candidate. And I think his views are so at odds with so much of the American public, he would not have been a better candidate.
But do you think people, apparently he was very attractive to young students and people, and some polls suggested, or I read some articles suggesting that those kind of students would rather prefer Trump rather than Sanders. So what happened?
Right. Well, yes, he was attractive to young people. And he'd go to college campuses and they'd all cheer, and got very enthusiastic. So that fraction of the vote, yes, I think he would have energized, and you would have gotten more of those people coming to the polls than did. Many of them stayed home. Mm-hmm. I don't think he was very attractive to Black Americans. I don't know whether he was very attractive to Hispanic Americans. So he would have energized a certain amount of the base, but I think there are a lot of Democrats who are middle-class people who would have been very perplexed by his views and very in disagreement and would not have gone to the polls. So one side maybe more, the other side less. So I find it very difficult to believe he could have prevailed.
Okay, that's good. Well, I have a son who believes that he would have been a better.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to show you and show him your perception. But anyway, the other thing is, as you know, in Mexico we are much interested. Mr. Trump, or President-elect Trump, has made a lot of contentions about trade, and he's suggesting that he's going to raise at 35%. But can you give us a sort of a sense of what are the 7 or whatever priorities, trade policies he's going to carry out when he enters into power in January? And do you have any sense of what is the order he's going to take? Right. Which one is going to be first and second and third or whatever?
Yeah, I think the first big one is that he's going to really take a very aggressive posture towards China. That's much stronger in his priorities and the priorities of many of his supporters than anything to do with NAFTA or Mexico or Canada. And so he will launch trade cases in the WTO, launch trade cases in our national administrative approaches, threaten China with potential tariffs. I think we're going to see big explosions on the economic front with China, which we've not had not since Nixon normalized or started the normalization of U.S. relations with China. And that will get a lot of attention. I don't think China will be very receptive to his demands, but there will be confrontations, I believe, there. Then, so that's the first priority. But he will immediately start this process of renegotiating NAFTA. What does that mean? Well, in my days here in Mexico, just last night and today, we're all trying to figure out what that means. And Mexico will have issues it wants to raise. Canada may have issues it wants to raise. The U.S. has demands by Trump, but he hasn't really articulated his demands in terms of very concrete. He just thinks life is unfair. Mexico hasn't done what it should have done. So the specifics, I think, will be filled out in the course of the negotiations, and we'll get various interest groups in the U.S. coming forward with suggestions as to what Mexico ought to do to make for a better NAFTA. And that may lead to a number of side agreements or protocols proposed. Maybe Mexico won't accept any of that. Then the U.S. won't accept the Mexican or Canadian proposals on issues. But I think this process of negotiation, which Congress will want to get involved in, will take at least 6 months and could take longer. So I think we have a good space of time before the Trump trade threats, which is this 35% tariff, terminating NAFTA, begin to become a realistic possibility. And meanwhile, his domestic program will probably go forward. So maybe that's more distant. At least I'm hopeful that it's more distant than the immediate fireworks with China.
When you mentioned side agreements, the way that side agreements were negotiated with NAFTA, you remember the
Right.
There was a position to NAFTA, and then so that could be the way to go. And would Congress would have to somehow take up. Would have to accept them, authorize them, or could this be done at the executive level, the government to government?
Yes, well, he probably won't use the term side agreements because that phrase has become, not popular. So, but you call them protocols or whatever he calls them, whatever they're called.
Trump agreements.
Trump agreements.
Trump-Peña agreements or whatever.
Right. New name, new day. Does Congress have to be involved? Well, Congress would want to be involved and want to have these go up for kind of the normal trade negotiating kind of conclusion where Congress ratifies these. Trump could do a great deal without any congressional involvement as long as it doesn't require any change in U.S. laws. If it's just changes in Mexican or Canadian laws or procedures or regulations or whatever, then that doesn't require anything from the U.S. Congress doesn't require. But as a political matter, Trump would be well advised to try to keep Congress on board so that they don't, the Congress doesn't begin to be in a very opposite position to where President Trump is. So that remains to be seen. Now, Trump isn't talking about any concessions by the United States on any of the issues that we have with Canada. We have a big debate over softwood lumber, and there's always debate with Mexico over sugar and other issues. Trucking has been there forever. If he makes any concessions on any of these issues, then he might actually be required to go to Congress. But that remains to be seen. I think from a political standpoint, he will try to keep Congress engaged.
Okay, that's right. But he also talks about currency manipulation, other policies he wants to carry out. I think, and he mentioned during his campaign that there were 5 or 6 countries, not only Mexico. There were Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, and Germany. Is he planning? Has he suggested any kind of negotiation with them, or not? Just talked about them, but basically China and Mexico are the big issues.
Right, China and Mexico are the big issues, and this currency manipulation issue where the claim is the Chinese RMB, the Chinese yuan as it's also called, currency is too low. The value is too low, and that enables China to export more, is his central complaint. And he will call China a currency manipulator, or he'll get the Treasury, his new Treasury Secretary, to call China a currency manipulator right after, or shortly after he's elected, or sorry, after he's inaugurated and he becomes president. He hasn't mentioned Mexico on the currency, and of course the Mexican peso is now a lot lower, but that's because Trump was elected. So,
Yes.
and Mexico is certainly not manipulating its currency. By any way you define it, it's not manipulating its currency. So there's no grounds for saying that about Mexico. But here's the common theme in all the countries you named. They have trade surpluses with the United States.
Okay.
And Trump is a man who thinks in terms of trade deficits and trade surpluses. And if the United States is trading with a country which has a trade deficit with the United States, in other words, the U.S. is exporting more than it's importing, from Trump's view, well, that's great. If the United States is trading with a country where it's reversed, and the foreign country is exporting more than it's importing from the United States, that's not so good. So China has the biggest trade surplus, Japan has a trade surplus, Mexico has a trade surplus, Germany has...
Canada too, no?
No, Canada's a balance.
It's balanced now?
No, there's no, it's statistical error. It's so small.
Okay.
Actually, we have a trade surplus with them, but it's very, very small. It doesn't count. But Germany has a big trade surplus. So
Korea?
And Korea has a trade surplus. Not so big, but it's got a trade surplus. So that's the common feature of those countries. Now, are they all manipulating their currencies? Absolutely not. But they're all objects of Trump's criticism. So, now he might realize that if you start having fights with a lot of countries which had normally had good relation with the United States, that would not be good for the U.S. posture. I think on this issue of the currency manipulation, he will stick with China as the target. That's just a guess.
Okay. Now, he also talked about the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Alliance, and he hasn't mentioned the TTIP, the Transatlantic Agreement, but some experts suggest that the talks are already on hold. He's talked about exiting the WTO.
Yeah.
Is that likely to happen?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about TPP from the U.S. standpoint is dead. He said it many times in the campaign. Clinton also said it. So the U.S. will not participate in the TPP. Other countries may decide, including Mexico, that they want to go forward with the TPP, but it'll be without the United States, which I think will be a big diplomatic, geopolitical loss for the United States, but that's not how Trump sees it. Now, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, you're right, it's on hold. It wasn't a part of the presidential debate, but it seems very unlikely that he'll want to pick up and go forward with that because he doesn't want new trade agreements. And what he said earlier in the campaign, in the primary phase of the campaign, he said, I like trade. That's what he said. You wouldn't believe it, but he said, I like trade. And I will negotiate with individual countries. So TTIP is not with individual countries. It's with this whole group of the European Union, and maybe you could count that as an individual country. I don't think that's how Trump sees it. So I don't think TTIP will go forward. Now, on the WTO, yes, he said he'll walk from the WTO. If need be, he doesn't. Well, his advisors will tell him, if they haven't already, that this would be very damaging to the United States because other countries would be perfectly free to raise their tariffs across the board against the United States or on individual products. There'd be no rules of the commercial world. And you may recall that the former Swedish Prime Minister, Carl Bildt, recently wrote an opinion piece saying he thought that Trump was the end of the Western world as we knew it. He took a very gloomy view, and in part because of these quite strident anti-international economic, anti-globalization statements.
Now, we know, just taken advantage of the fact that Prime Minister Abe of Japan is coming to Washington tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
My feeling is that he's coming to present himself and say what's going to happen, because as you said, United States announced that he's walking away from the TTP,
Right.
but I think Japan is very much interested in TTP,
Right.
and also in the security relationship.
Right, right.
Do you think Mr. Abe could be someone who may play a important role in saying, this, Mr. Trump, you have to reconsider this. It's a very important agreement. Let's go forward, whatever. Is there any chance of that?
Well, I think that would be too much of a reversal to reconsider TPP, because it was denounced so strongly and so often in the campaign. It's hard you can't just reverse that overnight. However, Abe is, coming back to how Trump worked, I think Trump is very influenced by meetings with individuals whom he regards as on his wavelength. And if Abe gets along well with Trump, which he might do, he's also a pretty strong personality, that would influence Trump a lot. Maybe more than position papers or what have you. One possibility is that Abe will tell Trump that, well, why don't we consider a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement? That's a single country, two single countries, not part of the TPP, but just separate from the TPP. And that was suggested by Senator Hatch just yesterday. So, that could be a possibility. I think even if they don't go very far on the trade front, Trump will reinforce the concept of a U.S.-Japan alliance, even though during the campaign he made some statements that he didn't think Japan and Korea were paying enough to support U.S. troops and so on. But I think at this stage, he's elected, everything, he will find common ground with Abe on the basic military alliance.
Okay. Well, going back to the Prime Minister from Sweden that took this dim view about the implications of Mr. Trump policies, you carried out studies about the potential economic impacts of some of the trade policies of Mr. President-elect Trump. What were the major results that you came up with?
Well, we really focused on the U.S. economy, so we didn't look at the world economy, but there would be big impacts around the world. And if we took Trump's most extreme statements, namely 45% tariff on China, 35% tariff on everything from Mexico, and those two countries retaliated, which could be reasonably expected with equivalent restrictions on U.S. exports, the U.S. economy would not grow for approximately 2 years, and in fact would decline slightly, and some parts of the U.S. economy would be extremely hard hit, meaning that unemployment would be increased by 10%, which is a lot. For the U.S. in certain communities, not across the board, but certain communities, Seattle, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, some parts of Texas, some agricultural communities in Missouri. There would be big loss, and it would be very adverse. It couldn't be good for the stock market. It would look quite bad. And I think the repercussions globally would be very depressing, especially since we're now in a phase where world trade is not growing. It's not growing. So this would look like, well, maybe world trade is going to go down.
It has been going down, not recently.
It's dropped slightly. In nominal terms, it's dropped a little bit, whereas previously it had been growing much faster than world economy. So we're not in a good phase anyway, and this would put it in a much worse phase, and I think you could count on the world economy growing slower as a result of all of that. So it'd be quite gloomy, and all countries would reconsider their geopolitical relations, and the U.S. might, end up isolating itself. So the outcome is so negative, and Trump's advisors in the State Department, the Defense Department, the Central Intelligence Agency will inform him of all of this. I mean, they'll have detailed reports. Maybe he doesn't read detailed reports. They'll summarize it in a couple of pages. The Wall Street people will tell him also. So all of that, I think, reduces the likelihood that he'll pursue those extreme policies which were part of the election debate.
How would that express in the negotiation with Mexico, which will start according to his comments or his announcement? Is going to start the first day it takes place. So how do you see developing that negotiation with Mexico?
My guess on the negotiation with Mexico is that it'll be a grab bag of issues that various firms and bring up towards Mexico, and then Mexico brings up against the U.S. and Canada brings up as well. And maybe there'll be a lot of little protocols or what have you. In addition, I think Trump will try to get some multinational corporations which are engaged in Mexico to announce big employment increases in the United States, big splashy announcements, 1,000 jobs here, 500 jobs there, so forth, by firms like General Electric, IBM, Apple, what have you. He might get enough out of the negotiation that he just backs off of this notion of putting on some tariffs or terminating NAFTA. But as long as the negotiations are going forward, he's going to keep those threats kind of in his back pocket. So they will be tough negotiations, and they might very well fail. But I think the failure of the negotiations would be as hard on the United States as its trading partners. So Trump will get more interest in coming to a successful conclusion.
Well, I hope you're right. And then a final question. Thanks a lot for everything you've said. But a final question. He has also pointed out that the importance of border security,
right,
which impacts directly in the question of migration.
Right.
How do you see that? Why does he tie border security with migration and deportation?
Right.
How do you see that developing?
Well, again, Trump is a man who has an instinctive feeling of what gives him a headline. And that's why he raised these issues, and it did resonate amongst many Americans and obviously helped propel him during the primary campaign and distinguish him from the other primary candidates because he was so strong in his remarks. Whether he's aware of the facts, I don't know. I mean, the fact is that the stock of undocumented immigrants in the United States has been at about 11 million for several years. It's not increasing, according to our census. And the flows from Mexico are either more Mexicans are returning to Mexico than coming from Mexico, or it's about balance. It's not a real issue today, but it's a political issue, which is very different from being a real numbers issue. So given that it's a political issue, and he made it a great big political issue, I think one thing he will do is increase the number of Border Patrol forces. Now, maybe that's a big waste of money, but he wants to increase defense spending generally, and he might put this in the defense spending budget and, hire another 5,000, 10,000, whatever, a lot of people on the border. And in addition, he now just said a few days ago in a tweet that he's going to get to 2.5 or 3 million undocumented immigrants who are criminals and return them to Mexico, or return them from wherever they came from. If those are huge numbers, huge numbers. I guess he'll do something, but if he were to do anything along those, that kind of numbers, it will be just an enormous political explosion, both in the United States and in Mexico, because that would pull people out of their communities where they're working, they have kids who are Americans, they're loved by their neighbors, by their employers, and suddenly they're hauled up and sent away. And there'll be a lot of adverse human interest stories, and that will get all sorts of negative attention so far as Trump is concerned in the United States. Obviously, it would be very very badly received in Mexico. Again, I'm thinking that these statements may be more just for, public consumption, and he won't really carry it out because his advisors will inform him quite dramatically of the adverse consequences that would follow from that kind of, repatriation. I mean, it's nothing we've ever done in our history. So we've stopped immigration in the 1920s from China and Japan, but returning.
I think you did return some.
We returned
100,000 Mexicans.
Well, we returned 100,000.
Yeah, but
100,000 is one number. 1 million is to the ceiling.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I guess 100,000, probably there were more. But let me mention, I didn't realize that Mr. Giuliani had come with Trump when he visited Mexico. He gave a.
Oh, did he?
He did, and he gave an interview a few days ago, and he said that he had been there, that there had been discussions about the wall, but that they had also mentioned, well, that we found common grounds, common problems. And one of those problems were Mexico has problems with Central Americans, and we have, which led me to believe to the question that I can pose to you. You remember after September 11, with the terrorist attacks, there was this discussion about perimeter security. Security perimeter. To what extent in these discussions there might be this one way to collaborate is ask Mexico to find ways in which prevent. Do you think that's prevent Central Americans, or find ways in which dissuade Central Americans? Do you think that's on the table?
Well, it's a possibility, and it's one we've raised in our writings, and you've been written about this academically, and I think it would make some sense in terms of you're worried about terrorists to have a perimeter around North America and agreed terms of how you screen people who are coming in from other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East. It's a possibility. It could be an area of cooperation. So if he thinks about cooperation, if he's really thinking about terrorists, and that was a big part of his, again, political rhetoric, that there's an area where we could, in fact, cooperate.
But it wouldn't apply to the Central Americans, I guess.
No, I mean, you're right. We wouldn't embrace Central America but it would be the thought that maybe some people are coming in from who knows where, Iraq, to Central America and then trying to cross the border.
Okay,
it's all very hypothetical.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I think you gave us an excellent and comprehensive view of what is likely to happen in the next couple of months. Yeah. And and perhaps an end note, any optimism that you think that the fact that recently, in recent days, there has been an announcement by Mr. Trump that they're going to be carried out some studies about the implication of his policies. So that process might make him change his mind, because in the end, as you suggest in your studies, it's a shoot. You shoot your food, no? And do you think he may come to his senses and figure out ways in which, just by, as you said, by finding ways in which some companies would announce increased employment, etc., he would be satisfied? Or do you think he's definitely convinced that he has to have a deal in which there is always the U.S. gains here, gains with Germany, gains with Mexico, gains with Japan? Do you think he's willing to go all the way through?
I think the extravagant statements were intended to, and they succeeded in getting him elected. And they were election statements. And now he's president. And all the advice he's getting will be to slow down, think hard about the implications of the policies. Yes, he may have some advisors who are, go on the direction you announced in the campaign. I think the majority of advisors will urge him to go slow, especially on the international side. And, presidents always are tempered in their initial high ambitions by the realities of the situation. I think that will happen with Trump, so that it will be far less, less shocking in terms of application than it was in terms of the debate.
Well, let's hope that you are right, because that's what we are expecting in Mexico.
Right.
That our relationship with the United States is important. That kind of policies would just deteriorate the relation terribly. So I hope you're right, and let's make our best hopes for that.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.